Today, her son David and her daughter-in-law Christy follow in her footsteps, also teaching at Boone County High School. She is the proud grandmother of Ethan and Eliza Cole, and the historical groups of which she is a member include the Boone County chapter, the DAR, Colonial Dames and Magna Carta Dames, as well as the Jamestown Society. She is a member of Boone County Homemakers and of Hopeful Lutheran Church. And I suppose I would be remiss if I did not mention that her mother, Elizabeth Dell Goodridge Nestor, served as president of one of the past Boone County Historical Societies, and for many years she worked preserving and recording Florence and Boone County history. Jenny, on behalf of the Society, welcome and thank you for being here this evening.
Michael, you make me feel so good and so welcome, and what really makes me feel good is that I look around the room and I see so many friends, and that's wonderful. I thank you for coming, as well as the fact that the people I haven't met yet, I hope sometime I'll be able to call you friend too. Thank you very, very much. When I was a child, there were 3 days of the year that were really, really important to me, and almost as important as Christmas and Easter and my birthday. And those days normally occurred the 3 last days of August, the fair. And from the time I can remember, my mama and mother would take me early in the morning when the fair opened. And we would immediately see what the program was in the ring and watch whatever it was. It didn't matter whether it was cattle or whether it were horses. It didn't matter. We watched and loved it. And then about 11 o'clock, we would leave and go home, have a little lunch, take a spit bath, and I was forced to have a 30-minute nap. And then we would get in the car and come right back into the fair, of course, showing our stamp. And we did this every single day, and we were there until the fair closed. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful memory for me, and something so valuable that I can't even tell you. And one of the things, though, that I will share is Mother was a good shot. Mother was taught, now some of you might smile at this, but Mother told me that she was taught to shoot by the grandson of Geronimo, and she even had photographs, which I have, to prove that, her with him. And anyway, when we went to the fair, well, of course, they had that one game where you would stand behind a wooden shelf, and there were 4 rifles, and you selected your rifle, and of course then you shot trying to hit the target. Well, the carnival people always fix the sights, at least that's what Mother always said. And anyway, after the first or second shot, she could then adjust the way she shot to go on and win me prize after prize after prize. I just had to bring this to you because this was, I don't know how many of you remember these at the fair? Well, anyway, this was one of the things Mother won for me by shooting the target. And of course, remember the canes? And that too. And what you'll find interesting a little bit later is that one of the privileges that was sold at these fairs, they were toys for children, and these canes at the old fair were also one of the privileges sold. And I have to tell you this one more story. Never forget this. This was the day that Mother entered the hog calling contest. And I begged her, oh please, please, Mommy, don't do that, please. I was mortified. I was absolutely mortified. But much to my chagrin, her suey seemed to be music to the judge's ears, and Mother won. And I remember I was hiding the whole time under the church pews where all the nursing mothers sat. Do you remember that? Where they were, the nursing mothers? Hi. And so anyway, those were just a couple, and I know that what we're doing is, what my charge is to talk to you about the history of the old fairs, but I just needed to kind of work into that because there were wonderful things that delighted me with the 4-H and Utopia Fair as well. And I know these things had to happen at the others. The homemade desserts at those church booths were just wonderful. And those ladies vied with each other to have something better than the other one. And the ladies all looked beautiful in their summer cottons and their beautiful homemade aprons. And then also the rows and rows and rows of farm animals and various farm creatures that, I was just astounded by and walk up and down looking at all of those. And the horse shows, when the riders rode in and out of the barrels, I thought that was fabulous. And then the beautiful handmade quilts with those perfect stitches, and I'm real proud. These are all made by Mama and Mother. And if you notice that, and these have been entered in the old fair. And this one says Virginia Goodrich, 1904. Mother's was 1930, and later on I'll say it, but nevertheless, the last fair was in 1932, and those were entered. And over here, the ribbons, right there, they're faded now, but they didn't have any fancy ribbons at the old fairs. But those were blue ribbons, which they got. And wonderful historic designs, perfect stitches. And and I'm sure that what has happened with our fair, was patterned after all these other wonderful previous fairs that came and evolved from simpler times. So that brings us then to the very first fair. And that fair, and also what I'm going to be doing is Mother wrote the history of the fairs in 1953, and that was printed in the Recorder. And in fact, she says in here that I have many more minute details on this fair, and at a later time will expand on this paper. Well, she didn't have the opportunity to expand on the paper. I've expanded on her paper. So tonight, it isn't just I speaking to you. It's Mother speaking to you as well. And that just thrills me to pieces to be able to do that. So a lot of times when you hear that personal pronoun, I, it's Mother speaking in here, because I have kind of put it together, what all the rest that I have found out and put in with what she did. The information given in regard to the old Florence Fair on Captain Jack Barton's farm has been given to me by word of mouth. However, this information was given by people whose word I do not question, and I assume it is to be correct until it is proved otherwise. And for this part, I did not have written record. Now, in regard to the North Kentucky Agricultural Association, organized in 1895, the details are in every way correct. I have in my possession the original and only minute books of this organization from its beginning until it was dissolved. I have many more minute details. And anyway, there are 4 of these. And I didn't bring them all because I didn't really see the necessity in bringing all of them. But I wanted you to be able to look at the beautiful, beautiful script that these men wrote. And Mr. Perry, R.J. Perry, when he was secretary, I loved it. I mean, his grammar's gorgeous, his script is beautiful, his description is perfect. He did everything in such a wonderful, wonderful way. And when all of a sudden he was absent for 2 meetings, then I got worried, because I thought, uh-oh, something's happened, and he had died. Never again did any of the minutes ever look like that. And so I only brought the one because I thought perhaps you would enjoy at least seeing how beautiful, beautiful that script is. Now, the exact beginning date of the first Florence Fair, known as Old Florence Fair, is unknown. But I know, not I, Mother, I know it existed in 1845 because my father's sister, Catherine Goodrich, was dressed to go to this fair, and her escort, Mr. Gaines Robinson, was at her home to take her when she fell dead. Our family Bible states she died in 1845. Now, I also know that it was even before 1845 because after wonderful phone conversations with John Brady Walton, he shared with me that in 1844 at that fair, his great-great-grandmother McGlasson from England met his great-great-grandfather Walton at that first fair. So we know at least 1844, and I suspect before that too. Okay, this fair, this is what Mother writes. This fair was located on the farm of Captain Jack Barton. Now, when Sue Kate so kindly did some work with me and let me look in her atlas of 1883, it says John Barton, but I know a lot of times that Jack can be a nickname, for John. So anyway, the original house of this farm is still standing and is occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Braun. Now, I don't know how many of you would, if that house isn't there anymore. What a gorgeous, gorgeous house it was, because the Brauns had it after Captain Barton had it. And it was a beautiful southern home with a central hall and beautiful rooms on either side and a beautiful staircase. And I know Alice Conrad has been in that house before because Alice, Mother, and Mrs. Braun were all DAR members, and Mrs. Braun frequently would host DAR meetings at that house, and it was wonderful. I'm so sorry that was ever torn down, but a lot of things have been torn down. The original farm comprised what is now Kentaboo. The fair mentioned was located on the ridge behind this house I've described to you. There were two entrances to the fair, one through Captain Barton's farmyard and one opening on the creek road. Well, this week I had a good time. I went down a road I didn't even know existed, right there off of Dixie Highway, and it's on the right, it almost abuts Hagedorn's building. And of course, this is across from the Honda motorcycle store, and it's called Dry Creek Road. I didn't realize that it was there. And you be careful if you want to go down there, because the cement does this right away off of the highway. And there's only one house there on the left, but when I went back there, you can still see, it's still undeveloped, and there still is, I believe, Dry Creek right there. And that was where one of the entrances was for this first fair. Now, over on the other side, it's China Food, and then there's where you can go buy chili. And it's called Lexington Avenue, and I'm thinking it might be Lexington Avenue because it used to be called Lexington Pike. And when you drive down there, just a short distance and look to the right, that was where this old house was, and that was also where the other entrance was to this fair. And at this point, I really would like Sue Kate to come on down here because I've had a wonderful time. This is a tag team thing here today. And I've had a great time, and she's been very kind to help me. And I'm going to let her talk to you about what she brought, because I found out through her what the real name for that very first fair was.
Okay, if you look at, I have in my possession the Northern Kentucky Agricultural Society bulletins of their things, and it says 10th Annual Fair, 1867. So my question, do you think
There was one before that?
Something before that?
Yeah.
But the interesting part are some of the things that they have in here. And we cannot understand the reading for the woolen manufacturer's display, things that you would win prizes on. 10 yards of fine jeans. But it says do 10 yards. What does the do mean?
And it's D.O.
It's D.O. So we've had a fun time just going through here and looking at the things that they had at their fairs. Some of the things they call, and it must be milk cows, M-I-L-C-H. This is, and I have several of these. I have about 10 of them, and I have no idea where I got them. But here, in this page here, you can absolutely see where the fairgrounds is. This is the 1883 Atlas, and I'll have to tell you, I have 3 of them by mistake or I don't know what. But here is the fairgrounds, and I suppose this is the little dry creek they're talking about. But it is listed as J. Barton here, and that's all it says. But it does have the fairgrounds, and it has all the little buildings on it. So I think that's interesting.
It says fair.
It says fair.
Yeah.
It says fair. Okay. But this, do feel free to look through this because I have another one. So, but it is interesting to see what they had at their fair. A little, they put different. Thank you.
The land was leased, as we said, from Captain Barton for the fair, which lasted a full week. The amphitheater was round with elevated seats and a promenade around the top. The refreshment stands were octagon shaped and served beer, whiskey, cider, and lemonade. There were booths under the amphitheater where families would eat, and for days before the fair, men would come and whitewash everything, so by the time that it was ready, everything was just snowy white. Mr. and Mrs. Gaines Robinson lived in the fair cottage. Mr. Robinson was a brother of Mrs. Lucy Martin, and during the fair, she took care of all of the washrooms and etc. The only directors whose names I, Mother, am certain of were Milton Goodrich, Butler Carpenter, and Mike Rouse. 2 of the best-known writers and judges were Alec and Hub Buckner. The first day was always Ladies' Day. Quilts, cakes, candies were shown in the center of the ring, and they were taken home that very night. Mrs. Kate Perry brought potted flowers from Fort Mitchell. Mrs. Milton Goodrich always showed her fig tree. Mrs. Sally Fulton took a miniature church made of shells under a glass globe, which Mother said she had seen. People came by horseback, horse and buggy, hacks, and a stagecoach came from Covington. Now, some money premiums were given, but most premiums were solid silver cups, spoons, forks, and knife sets. The story was told to Mother that a Miss Lizzie Nichols from the Bluegrass region near Lexington had just won the blue ribbon for riding when someone threw an empty candy box into the ring, and the horse bolted and threw Miss Nichols. She was taken out for dead, but was only stunned and then recovered. Displays were shown of buggies, surreys, and hacks. The buggies had storm fronts with isinglass windows to see through, and holes through which the lines went. Horses wore handsome fly nets, and horse blankets and whip concessions were greatly in demand as they were good sellers. That fair closed in 1880. Now, the reason for closing, and this is what people had told Mother, was that each director had free admission for himself, his family, and friends. And as a result, there was a drop in attendance. Mother said she talked with people who attended that fair, and they stated that when the fair did close, the buildings showed great age and were falling down, so that attests to the fact that that fair had been going on for some time. Following that fair, the society, that was the society. The North Kentucky Agricultural Association was organized December 29, 1895 at the Oddfellows Hall, Florence, Kentucky, which is, of course, Stringtown Restaurant. First officers elected were B.F. McGlasson, President, E.H. Blankenbaker, which is Joe Clinton's great-grandfather, Vice President, G.J. Allen, Secretary, William Perry Carpenter, Treasurer, and Lana, now he was
He is mother's grandfather,
Okay.
great grandfather.
He's your great-grandfather.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, that's right.
Yes, and it, of course, was he who rented the property to the Fair Board. Directors were F.A. Oots, Orrin Percival, W.C. Harris, J.J. Rucker, and J.M. Lassing. Originally, there were 81 stockholders, and each share was $50, and I'm so excited because finally, I found my great-uncle George's billfold in Boston Gold, George Goodrich, and here are the sales receipts for the North Kentucky Agricultural Association for my great-uncle George and my grandfather. So I was pleased to be able to find that. At the second meeting on January the 11th, 1896, the board voted to have $8,000 worth of capital stock to be divided into 480 shares at $16.75 each, and no one was allowed to purchase less than 3. Secretary Carpenter was directed to rent a deposit box at the Erlanger Bank. The cost for that box was $1, and of course they put all their valuable documents there. The grounds had already been leased, and the pond was already made, and I'm thrilled because Pam has talked about the pond being there, but over where you all grew up, fairgrounds, and a committee had already gone to the county fairgrounds with the architect to try and discover what could possibly be good construction. The first 7 board meetings were held at the Oddfellows Hall, which they rented for 50 cents a meeting. After the first meeting, plans were made to build an amphitheater on the ground rented from William Perry Carpenter, and they rented that for $102 per year. And that was located at the corner of the Union and Lexington Pike across from the Florence Christian Church. The show ring was to be 160 feet in diameter, with the amphitheater rounded to be 10 seats high and covered with a roof. And I love this. Those seats had backs, 16 inches high, backs to support your back while you watched what was going on. A promenade, which was 9 feet in the clear with an outside rail of 4 feet high, was to go around the entire top. And 4 entrances to the amphitheater. Each were 14 feet wide. The entrance to the show ring was 12 feet wide and 10 feet high, and the secretary and treasurer's office was located over the stable entrance. 25 benches were purchased from the Old Fair Company for $5 each. These benches, and it states this in the minutes, had to be moved quickly to get out of the way of the society. And see, that's what I kept thinking, the society, until I got with Sue Kate and found out that that was the name of the first organization, the North Kentucky Agricultural Society. I wasn't quite sure what that was. The ground was covered by a heavy woods, and a sawmill was set up there. Mr. Carpenter was paid $2.25 for every 1,000 feet of beech lumber cut. Tom Corbin supplied 500 9½ foot black locust posts at 25 cents each, and 60 posts 17 feet long at 75 cents each. The grounds were cleared of bushes, trees, logs, and buck bushes. The lumber that went into the amphitheater and music stand was all sawed right there on the grounds. The music stand was in the center of the ring, and it also was an octagon. The amphitheater was located only 107 feet from the outside property line, so that was very, very close to the Lexington and Union Pike. David Osborne was hired to dig a well for $15. Cisterns were built, and I might add that large barrels were placed at intervals, the eye is mother, for drinking. There was a spout at the bottom. As a child attending the fair, I remember we were all supplied with collapsible tin cups, and she said we kept those every year and brought them back for use at the fair. She also remembers that the water barrels were covered with green moss collected over the years and filled at random with any source of water that was available. The water ran into the cups and was full of tadpoles and wiggle worms. This didn't bother us in the least. We just stuck our finger in and took them out and drank the water. Of course, now we would be sure we would die. 50 stalls for stabling animals were built for 75 cents each using the lumber on the grounds. There were also 14 box stalls. Those of us who remember these stalls now know they were located to the right of the amphitheater in a straight line running from the road to the back of the property. The stock gate entrance was located just in front of these stalls, and it was across from where Sam Denham Jr. and his family used to live. And if you don't know where that is, it's where there's St. Paul's Church right here. Right over here is a red brick building, 2-story with a porch on it, and that's where Sam Denham used to live, and across from that was where the stock gate was. And the main gate was located across from the Christian Church on the corner of the Union and Lexington Heights. Plans were made to build a cottage. Mr. Jerry Griffith was contracted to build the dwelling for $349. Its length in front was 32 feet with 2 square rooms of 16 feet. The height of the main building was 18 feet, and there was an entrance to the stairway through the kitchen. At the first fair, both the amphitheater and the cottage were unfinished, but were able to be used and were finished before the coming winter. Now, if you turn onto Gibbons Street and you go all the way back, there is that cottage, and I feel certain that is the cottage. And in fact, Mr. Robinson, we just shared that beforehand. Mr. Robinson said too, because he had purchased one of the original lots and has lived there all of his life there, that little cottage is the original fair cottage. As well as the fact that where Ted Bushelman lives, which is the 2-story house, I told him that my whole life, Mother always told me that was the public restroom, and he said, yes, it was. But he said a lot of things went on in that particular. A barbed wire fence was built around the entire fairgrounds. Pens for hogs and sheep were constructed, and the floral hall was built under the amphitheater, and booths measuring 16 feet square were finished. The first annual fair was held September 3, 4, and 5, 1896. The board set the admission fee for 25 cents for anyone over 10, all others free. All stockholders had to pay at the gate. There were no complimentary tickets at all. And the total of gate receipts for those 3 days was $2,457.10, which I think is really wonderful when you consider how transportation at that time was such a problem and that it was a new fair. I think that's wonderful. For this fair, Mr. J.J. Rucker was instructed to buy 9 washpans, 3 dozen towels, 6 combs, 6 hairbrushes, and 1 flag. Now, the washpans were used in the cottage, and everyone dipped the water to wash their hands. The combs and brushes were all a community affair. The flag was raised over the bandstand. The first day of the fair, there was a ladies' bicycle race with premiums of $10 and $5. The second day was a men's bicycle race with the same premiums. These were in addition to the regular showing of stock, floral hall, etc. Mr. Milton Goodrich, who was then living in Oldham County, came every year from LaGrange to judge the fruits and the vegetables, and he continued to do this until he died in 1929. Yeah. It also seemed, though, that there were people, of course, who assisted him, and that Mrs. Rector, Mrs. Perry Allen, Mrs. Cowan had a terrible time trying to decide to whom should go the blue and the red ribbons. The privilege of renting booths was auctioned to the highest bidder. No intoxicating drinks were allowed, And the board, and this was really stressed in those minutes, the board warned they would be inspecting daily, and they would close any booth at any time for any infraction of those rules. The first booth was auctioned to Castleman and Olsner for $166. The second to James Clore for $191. He also bought the third, which was next to the cottage. T.D. Adams paid $30 for the fourth booth, and Henry Chan paid $26 for the fifth. There was a baggage room, and that was auctioned off to F.A. Oots for $15, so I'm assuming, you know, that's where you would go and check all of your things and pay to do that. O.B. Sleet was given the exclusive privilege to sell campaign buttons. This was an election time, big time. His rent was $5. F.T. Foster paid $10 to be able to sell jewelry. And finally, if there was space, then people could display their vehicles. Cole and Riggs were allowed free admission upon the promise to run a first-class bus to meet all of the trains at Erlanger and charge only 10 cents a trip to the fair. And of course, that bus was pulled by horses. The board contracted several individuals to work at the fair. Hank Tanner, and Alice Conrad had said she certainly does remember Hank Tanner as the ringmaster and how wonderful he was. He got $1.50 a day. Mother wrote, "How thrilling to remember Mr. Tanner, tall and raw boned, announcing each entry, standing with a large whip in his hand. He was my hero, and if, as a child, I could get any recognition for him or a pat on the head, my day was complete. This sometimes occurred as he was a friend of my father, who was a stockholder in the fair. He continued as ringmaster until the fair was discontinued." Also, who could not remember, and of course this is different for most of you, most everybody in here, Albert Cleek and his mother Ellen. These were fine, and I'm just quoting the way she wrote this, these were fine colored people. Ellen was the matron at the cottage and received $5 for 4 days' work. Albert, her son, was commonly called Biscuit, and he was a tall, well-built colored man who was everybody's friend. He stayed in the ring, and he held all the wild animals. When everyone else was afraid, including, she said, the strong men, Biscuit was the only one who seemed to be able to be brave enough to handle all of the animals. This was before the mechanical age, and everything was done with horses and mules, and the type of animals that were shown at the fair were the very best, and they were very spirited. Biscuit managed to subdue them all. And he also restored lost children to their mothers and other sundry things like that. Ezra Rouse was hired to be the collector for the minstrel show. He was paid $1.25 a day. And this thrilled me to read this. Sam Lilly was hired as a waiter in the ring for $1.25 a day. Now, Sam Lilly was, when he was a young boy, he was a slave on my great-grandfather's farm. And when the time came that, of course, slavery was abolished, my great-grandfather said, "I'm so sorry, but I don't have the money to pay you wages. You will have to go." And Mother said that she was being told this as a little girl. But anyway, she said that they cried and did not want to leave. And what made me really know that perhaps that was so true, because when my mama, Virginia Goodrich, died and was laid out at the old Chambers and Grubbs funeral home, and Mother and I were standing by Mama's casket, we looked at the door, and in came this old, bent-over black man, and he was supported on either side by young black people. And Mother said, "Oh, it's Sam Lilly." And he came over and just was so sweet and kind and paid his respects. And I know that it was hard, because by that time he had to be close to 100. I know he did. But anyway, that thrilled me to even see that he was a part of this. In October 1896, after the first fair, permission was given to J.M. Lassing, who represented the campaign committee, to rent the grounds for $100 for a barbecue and political speaking. The speaker was William Jennings Bryan, known as the silver-tongued orator, who was running for President of the United States. The cottage was completed finally, and it was rented to Joseph Lale at $5 per month, allowing the board to use the first floor during the fair. Now, this one picture right here that I think is just so wonderful of the girls up here in the top. And this girl is Jenny Lale, and she certainly would have known about the fair because it was her dad who rented the cottage. And when I had these copies made, the gentleman who made it said he loved that picture. He thought that picture was wonderful. The fair was advertised in the Cincinnati Enquirer, Times-Star, Post, Boone County Recorder, Williamstown Courier, Warsaw Independent, Commercial Tribune, and Ohio Farmer. Fair privileges were rented for the basket room, feed room, barber shop, and melon room. See, it took me a while in the beginning when I was going through all of the minutes to figure out what a privilege was. I didn't know. And of course, you know, the privilege meant that then, you know, if they wished to have a service to make money, they wished to sell a product, then they paid so much for that privilege to do that. Also, the minstrel and vaudeville shows, they had a doll rack, and I have no idea what African Dodger was, except it was some sort of a game. Mr. W.C. Harris came before the fair board and said he was due a $4 gasoline stove for a first prize on a quilt. So he was given his gasoline stove. Now the fair grew, and in 1898 the receipts, now that's just 2 years. In 2 years their receipts were $14,689.30, and often 10,000 people came in one day. Because when you figure that it cost about 35 cents to get in, that takes a lot of 35 senses in order to make that kind of money. Some of the special premiums were 1 case of wine for the best display of fruit. Goodness gracious, John, what if you gave a case of wine at the fair now?
Uh-oh, can't do that.
That wouldn't be so good. Gold spectacles were given for a display of preserves, 5 pounds of gunpowder tea for display of flowers, and a bent wood churn to display 5 pounds of butter. The Oxford Down Association gave $50 for the best Oxford Down sheep, and the Erlanger Bank gave a $5 gold piece for the best Shropshire ram. The best sucking colt received a new riding bridle. Also, 1 case of communion wine, a mahogany rocker, 1 bonnet, 1 bull calf, and 1 folding bed were coveted prizes. Finally, in 1897, the fair board thought it was necessary to hire 10 experienced policemen for $2 a day. In 1899, the Southern Railroad said they would give reduced rates for all points north of Junction City to Cincinnati for those attending the fair, and half rate on all cattle, which would be shown at the ring in Florence. In November, a suit for damages was brought by a Mr. Crow of Walton because he had been arrested for climbing the fence to get in with no admission. He said that was false arrest. So he brought a suit against them. J.M. Lassing, who was a lawyer, was employed to defend that suit, and in 1901 the board went on and settled for that. In 1900, dining hall and kitchen were built by Dave Brown. The board voted to rent the hall. The renter could not charge over 35 cents a meal. And here were committees for the fair. So I guess you have all these kind of committees too, John. But anyway, here were committees for the fair. Music, printing, privileges, supervision, cattle, sheep and hogs, cleaning the grounds, hitching posts and fences. There are some changes there, I would think. And the board hired the 1st Regiment Band of Cincinnati, and they played all day long from 9 in the morning until dusk for $40 a day. New privileges were orange cider, and that orange cider, it keeps going and going and going, and people wanted that as a privilege, and it must have, whatever that orange cider was, it must have been really wonderful. And I've never heard of such a thing, orange cider, but nevertheless, that was a big thing. They had a returning ball game. There was a photo and phonograph booth and a cigar stand. And now the fair was advertised in Boone, Kenton, Campbell, Pendleton, Grant, Harrison, Gallatin, and Carroll counties. Due to the death of R.J. Perry, secretary, and please come down and look at that. As I told you, I was just in awe of Mr. Perry's organization, his grammar, his description, how complete he was, and how beautifully he wrote. And I really was worried and saddened when 2 meetings went by and he wasn't there, and I was afraid, and that's what it was. And Alvin Perry was elected to that office. But after Mr. Perry's death, the reports were extremely abbreviated. As an example, this is one of the minutes. The board discussed several subjects pertaining to the fair.
Oh.
That's all. That's all it was there. The treasurer at that time was A.M. Rouse, and Mr. McGlasson continued to be president. This year, the fancy turnout was won by Mr. John Fagan, with his lady companion being Miss Virginia Finch, later Mrs. Virginia Goodrich. Miss Finch wore a pale blue lace and piqué dress made by Mrs. Nanny Rouse. The dress was floor length and the Gibson girl style. She also wore a leghorn hat covered with pink roses and carried an imported lace parasol, which this is the parasol that Mama carried when she was in the fancy turnout. And I just want to show you the back of it. And these were the gloves that she wore with that. I want you to know you're very special because Mother never let me touch this. And this is the first time that has been opened as long as I can ever remember. August 1902, tin-type privileges were sold for $10. Stockholders received 15% and 14% dividends in these years. Mr. John Walton was granted permission to have colts the foal of his horse Brittany shown in the ring on the day draft horses were shown. Again, Mr. John Fagan won the fancy turnout with his companion Miss Finch. At this time she wore white muslin dress with French lace, another leghorn hat with black velvet and pink ostrich plumes. And you know what? And I can't imagine what this is, but boy, I wish maybe some of you know, and later on, please, if you did, they had a shabby turnout. Besides fancy turnout, they had a shabby turnout. So I thought that was interesting. In 1904, the board hired Charles Darnell to drill an artesian well. It took 205 feet to reach water. That year, the cottage was rented to Dave Osborne for $5 a month. In 19, C.T. Davis was elected treasurer, and the board borrowed $200 to pay 8% dividends. They also reduced the amounts of the sweepstake money premiums. That's the first hint that there might be some money problems. April 7th, 1906. Time was marching on. Things were changing. What had originally been called the Flying Dutchman with privileges rented for $25 was now the merry-go-round, and it was rented for $75. And the privilege to sell toys, whips, balloons, and canes was sold to a Mr. A. Beach for $25. And Mrs. J.H. Coher was awarded the privilege to do glass engraving. Now, that's Sue K. You want to? Anyway, I think this is wonderful. Here, come and, why don't you come and, kind of walking
I wonder
around?
who Harry, does anybody know who Harry Ooze is?
Yeah, it's, Harry Oots, but it says Florence Fair.
And I think I just went and bought that at Mary Woodward's auction. Was Mary Woodward in kin to, was she a Ooze?
Yes.
Yes. Well, then
Well, there you go.
that's who that is, because we bought this at Harvey Ooz's, at Mary Woodward's auction from the Florence Fair in 1906.
And isn't that beautiful? And it's in perfect condition. Some of the pieces that I have, I think I only have one that doesn't have chips, so that's wonderful. I don't have anything from the Florence Fair, not that one. Yeah. The board hired Dennis Conway to repair the road from Lexington Pike, and the Southern Railroad had all trains stop at Woodside. I don't know, Woodside. So think about that, and maybe, when I'm
That would
finished,
be
we
a-
can kind of
would
talk
that
about
be in
that, but at
Ellesmere?
Woodside,
That would be an announcement.
There's a Woodside Park along the railroad track in Ellesmere.
you think?
This side, the Florence side of, can't remember the street. Where the roller rink is?
Oh, yes.
Main Street.
Main Street, yeah.
Huh, okay, well, Woodside. Moving pictures and tents made their appearance at the fair. Annie Riddle became secretary, and the board borrowed $300 to pay the indebtedness of the fair. So that doesn't sound real good. In June of 1909, the board decided to subscribe $200 toward the proposed building of a street railway to Florence. And this was to be paid only when that first car was on the line on regular schedule by September 1st, 1911. No more mention was made of that. I'm assuming it didn't happen. In 1911, the fair reduced the number of days of the fair from 4 to 3. Admission was 30 cents for adults, 20 cents for children. And this, I thought, perhaps reducing the fair was just another hint of a problem. In 1914, Mr. Carpenter was killed with a hay fork. Plans to buy the grounds were discussed, and in 1915, Hubert Connor, board president, was appointed to bid on the grounds when it was to be offered for sale by county commissioners. Now, we're talking about reorganization. So in 1915, the fair was reorganized, the name was changed, it now is the North Kentucky Fair. It was incorporated with J.E. Williams as president, Hubert Connor secretary. The ground on the location previously rented was bought from the Carpenter heirs, and the cottage was rented to John Connor. The articles of incorporation were filed with W.R. Rogers, county clerk. Again, they had 9 directors. Their capital stock was $7,000, which was 700 shares. And the secretary and treasurer were appointed to settle with the original association for its buildings. In 1918, Coca-Cola made its appearance, paid $550 for all refreshment privileges except near beer, and sold dinners for 40 cents. The board moved, and I'm now quoting, to allow Negroes to use the fairgrounds for a fair after our fair for free. This was also the first year that the Boys and Girls Agricultural Clubs were formed, and Alice Conrad was a member of the Agricultural Club, because we had talked about that, and she said it was in that activity that she made an apron and took sewing classes. In 1920, the board voted to move the dining hall closer to Dixie Highway and convert the old one into a dance pavilion. In June of 23, plans were made to hold the first night fair. H.R. Leedy wired the ground for lights. The connection was made with the Union Light Heat and Power Company. Admission was 50 cents and no passes, again, to stockholders. Now, on June 28, 1924, the board allowed the Ku Klux Klan to hold a large convocation on the grounds. And I'd like to tell you how Mother told me she remembered that. She said she was a little girl then, and Main Street, Lexington Pike, Main Street, of course, was not paved. It was just a dirt road. But everybody knew. Word of mouth spread quickly that the Klan was going to be at the fairgrounds. And it wasn't just a local thing. It was a large contingency of surrounding counties. So people lined both sides of the street. And Mother said that as soon as they reached Ellesmere, in the area down where that first fair had been, that you could hear the drums beating, because they were marching to the beat of those drums and carrying torches. And as they came down Main Street, Mother said that it filled the whole street. They were linked arm in arm, 8 to 10 strong, and everyone had their hoods pushed back so they could be seen. Their identity was told, and Mother said there were a lot of familiar people, with that. So that was a story that I can never forget, really, when Mother told me that one. Of course, at that time, too, the Klan wasn't just anti-black. They were violently opposed to Catholics as well. Okay, the dance hall was built, costing $4,708, and the date for the opening dance was Saturday, May 30th, 1925. It lasted from 2:30 in the afternoon until 11 o'clock at night. Previously, an open dance floor had been built near Dixie Highway on the Lexington Pike. And for those of you who remember Charlie Carpenter, he was in charge of this for a time for the Fair Board. And Charlie would bring every Saturday, and I couldn't wait to, I loved him to death. And he would bring eggs to us every Saturday, and he and Mother would have a wonderful time talking about all the good times they had when they would dance there. Later, the dance hall was rented to Al Shields of Covington for $300 for the season, 2 nights a week, but not during the fair. On September 6, 1927, the Florence Deposit Bank became the treasurer. On June 5, 1929, due to the death of Mr. S.C. Hicks, president of the board, Clint Blankenbaker, Joe Clinton's grandfather, was elected president. Mrs. S.C. Hicks was appointed director. His wife was appointed director to fill his vacancy. This was the very first time and only time a woman was a director and on the board. They also felt at this point, the board thought they needed to have an assistant secretary. And those of you who had this gentleman as principal or teacher will be interested because they engaged Chester Goodrich to be the assistant secretary so that he could also sign checks. At this time, stockholders were from Erlanger, Covington, Florence, Burlington, Union, Walton, Cincinnati, Latonia, Hebron, Bulletsville, Verona, Ludlow, Independence, Crittenden, Corinth, Brookville, Alexandria, Newport, Norwood, Ohio, Maysville, and Detroit, Michigan. That was Mr. Sounder. In June 1931, J.P. Respis bought the corner lot, 175 feet square on the corner of Union and Lexington Pikes for $10,050. And the last fair was held 1932. In July 1935, the fairground was sold for $15,000. $5,000 to be paid down, $5,000 each to be paid in 1936 and 37. After paying that first $5,000, Smith and Gibbons of Corinth, the buyers, could not pay the balance. The fairgrounds were sold at the courthouse door. The fair company bought back a strip of lots on Dixie Highway. These were later sold at auction by the fair company on September 30th, 1944. This is my tag team here, Sue Kate. Oh, she had this wonderful document here, and that's not included in the minutes. So, yeah, that's interesting about the requirements for the lots.
I don't know whether I have the original copy, but I have the copy, this is a copy of it, but the original type thing about those lots being sold. That was in something, and it tells about it, but be sure and read the 3 provisions that these lots were to be sold. They were to be sold, had to have a dwelling of a cost not less than $4,000, and on all other lots, a cost of not less than $3,500. So that's how much those houses would have cost. But this is, and here is the catalog from the 1931 fair, which we figure is about
Almost the end.
almost the end.
1932
And
was
be
the last.
sure and look at the names that's in them, because you will be, some names are familiar, but back in the society, those names are not as familiar today.
Not that, the society, the original one, no.
We were amazed at the names that was in this book that we've never heard from again. So be sure to look at this here. And something else that talks about, she mentioned about the train, where they would bring the animals. You could pay for them to come to, on the Southern Railroad, and it would be free taking them back. Now, I have no idea why they pay for getting them there, and it was free going back.
Thank you for helping me so much, Kate. I really appreciate that. But in 1945, finally the company was dissolved, and the stockholders got $9, and there were 700 shares. And Mother wrote, with these transactions concluded, one of the most successful, interesting, educational, and uplifting enterprises ever to be held in Boone County passed out of existence, but surely never out of the hearts and minds of the many who attended during the years. And as an example of that, Alice remembers that her father, Albert Lucas, when she was 12, would give her 25 cents to go around, walk through, go to the various booths. She also talked to me about the promenade and how ladies would use the dressing rooms to change clothes during the day. She remembered the spike, nail, and hammer game where the strong young men would try to win a ham in 3 turns. Kathy Easton Caminiti told how her grandfather's team of horses won the best farm team. Her grandparents were Ambrose and Lenny Tanner Easton of the Easterdale Stock Farm. The horses also pulled cars out of the mud for $1 when nothing else could get them out. Romance blossomed at the fair. Children got lost, got sick, because they'd stuffed themselves with popcorn and pop. At the early time of the fair, transportation was slow, being horse-drawn. But at fair time, the men shined their shoes, pressed their clothes. The ladies had on new dresses that swept the ground. I, meaning Mother, was paid 50 cents each year by my father to shine his shoes and get his suit pressed, which I, of course, did at home with an old hand iron set on the coal range in the kitchen. And I can still remember the smell of his good cigars, which he smoked only when he went to the fair or to bank meetings at the Erlanger Deposit Bank, of which he was a director. Out of the goodness of God's great abundance, people far and wide brought the best of their crops and livestock to vie with each other for those coveted blue ribbons. The ladies were up at dawn filling huge closed baskets with fried chicken and fried apple pies. No modern pedometer could estimate the many thousands of miles that were walked during that time. People of this day never see the beautiful type of horses shown then. The haughty Percherons, many of dapple gray whose silken manes were intertwined with gorgeous ribbons, who threw their heads in disdain at mere men who came to see them, whose backs were so broad that if one were to try to ride, one's legs would have stood straight out. With the advent of the mechanical age and tractors, the horses have almost passed out of existence. Women competed in domestic arts both of cookery and needlework, and the beautiful satin embroidery of yesteryear scarcely seen today. One of the grandest sights was when farmers would bring in their entire herds of cattle for competing. The Holstein herd of Mr. Theodore Carpenter was indeed a sight never to be forgotten. Mr. Carpenter would be assisted in the ring by his sons, Charles, John, and Earl, and his herd would often comprise 15 to 18 cows together with a beautiful bull. Baby shows won interest, and in August 1914, the child of James Allen of Walton won first prize. The Times-Star of 1914 states, "The automobile has brought the county fair within reach of hundreds of persons who in years gone by were unable to visit the fair because of the distance which was so great from home. The day of the little gathering from the nearby countryside has passed, because modern progress has devised a means to overcome the difficulties of transportation. The hands across the boundaries of city and rural districts were all the firmer clasped when Mr. Cityman, surnamed Consumer, and Mr. Farmer, also called Producer, met at the Boone County Fair at Florence. That fair has always been the meeting ground for these two to strengthen the bonds of friendship."